When you hear the phrase Civil War, you probably first think about Marvel's Avengers Civil War movie. But did you know that America did have a civil war in reality? In fact, the American Civil War is described as the bloodiest and most destructive war in North American history. Let's find out what happened in the American Civil War. Hi, welcome to our channel. As we continue in our discussion of the wars that have made a mark in the world's history, we will now explain the American Civil War in this video. The American Civil War, also known as the War Between the States, was a 4-year-long conflict from 1861 to 1865 between the United States and 11 southern states. What do you think started this war? Before we begin, why don't you comment down below what your guesses are as to why the American Civil War happened? The United States Civil War started in 1861, following years of growing tensions between northern and southern states due to issues like slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 led to the secession of 7 southern states, which later formed the Confederate States of America, and 4 more states joined them shortly after. To better understand this, let's learn about the key events prior to the start of the war. The secession of southern states, occurring in a specific sequence: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina during 1860 to 1861, marked the climax of years of increasing tension over slavery. Meanwhile, from 1815 to 1861, the northern states experienced rapid economic modernization and diversification. Although agriculture, mainly reliant on free labor and composed mostly of smaller farms, remained dominant in the north, industrialization had begun to take hold. Additionally, Northerners heavily invested in an extensive transportation system, including canals, roads, steamboats, and railroads. They also focused on financial industries like banking and insurance, and developed a vast communication network comprising affordable newspapers, magazines, books, and the telegraph. In contrast, the Southern economy relied primarily on large farms, known as plantations, which cultivated cash crops like cotton and depended on enslaved people as the main workforce. Unlike Northerners who invested in factories and railroads, Southerners channeled their money into acquiring slaves, often more than they invested in land. Surprisingly, this strategy seemed financially sound to Southerners as late as 1860. During the 1850s, the price of cotton, the South's main crop, surged, causing the value of slaves, considered property, to rise accordingly. By 1860, Southern whites had a per capita wealth twice that of Northerners, and 3/5 of the wealthiest individuals in the country were Southerners. The issue of expanding slavery into new territories and states had been a concern since the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. When the slave state of Missouri sought statehood in 1818, Congress debated for 2 years before reaching the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This marked the beginning of a series of political agreements resulting from conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions regarding the spread of slavery into the western regions. The end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, which added approximately 500,000 square miles of new territory to the United States, intensified the dispute. In the 1850s, an increasing number of Northerners, motivated by moral concerns or a desire to safeguard free labor, believed that slavery should be abolished. Meanwhile, white Southerners feared that restricting slavery's expansion would lead to its demise. As the decade progressed, the two sides became more divided, and politicians found it harder to resolve the conflict through compromise. When Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the explicitly anti-slavery Republican Party, won the 1860 presidential election, 7 southern states, particularly South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed through on their threat and seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. During the early hours of April 12, 1861, rebels attacked Fort Sumter, situated at the entrance of Charleston, South Carolina's harbor. Strangely, this initial clash in what would become the deadliest conflict in U.S. history resulted in no casualties. Following a 34-hour bombardment, Major Robert Anderson surrendered his command, consisting of about 85 soldiers, to approximately 5,500 besieging Confederate troops led by Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Bourgard. In the following weeks, 4 more Southern states, namely Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, withdrew from the Union to join the Confederacy. This was just the beginning of what would be the bloodiest war in American history. What are your thoughts on the reason for this war so far? Tell us in the comments below. Now, let's continue. Initially, it appeared that the 23 states remaining in the Union after secession had a considerable advantage over the 11 Southern states. The North, home to around 21 million people, outnumbered the South, which had about 9 million residents, including roughly 4 million slaves. Moreover, the North boasted over 100,000 manufacturing plants, compared to 18,000 in the South below the Potomac River, and over 70% of the country's railroads were in the Union. The Union also had a significant lead in arms production, with a ratio of 30-1, a manpower advantage of 2-1, and a substantial share of commercial and financial resources. Additionally, the Union possessed a functioning government, as well as a small, yet efficient regular army and navy. However, the Confederacy was not destined to be defeated. Southern armies had the strategic advantage of fighting on interior lines, and the South had a strong military tradition rooted in the pre-1860 history of the United States. Additionally, the extensive Confederate coastline of 3,500 miles made blockading it a challenging task. Confederate President Jefferson Davis hoped for crucial foreign aid and intervention. Confederate soldiers were fighting for the establishment of a separate and independent nation based on what they called Southern institutions, primarily slavery. As the nation plunged into war, President Lincoln requested 75,000 militiamen to serve a 3-month term. He declared a naval blockade of the Confederate states, emphasizing that he considered them states in rebellion rather than a legally recognized sovereign country. Additionally, he instructed the Treasury Secretary to provide $2 million to support troop recruitment. Furthermore, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, initially on the East Coast and eventually across the entire country. Meanwhile, the Confederate government had previously approved the enlistment of 100,000 soldiers for a minimum service of 6 months, a number that was soon increased to 400,000. After the initial months of the war, George B. McClellan took over as the Supreme Commander of the Union Army, succeeding the aging General Winfield Scott. When Lincoln assumed office, Winfield Scott held the position of the Chief General of the Federal Forces. Scott, who was 75 years old at the time, had gained renown as a hero in both the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. Going back to McClellan, he was highly regarded by his troops, but he reportedly didn't show determination, often overestimated the Confederates' power, which resulted in delayed attacks, and openly showed disrespect for the president. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally led his Army of the Potomac up the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, capturing Yorktown on May 4th. However, Robert E. Lee, the commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces, and Thomas Jonathan Jackson successfully fought off McClellan's army in the 7 days' battles. McClellan, being cautious, requested more reinforcements to attack Richmond, but Lincoln declined and instead ordered the Army of the Potomac back to Washington. By mid-1862, McClellan was replaced as the Union General-in-Chief by Henry W. Halleck, although he retained command of the Army of the Potomac. Following the initial calls for troops by Lincoln and Davis, and as the war continued without a clear end in sight, both sides resorted to mobilizing large volunteer armies. Prominent local citizens with resources would organize regiments, initially under state authority, and later these units would be incorporated into the Union and Confederate forces. Both presidents appointed what were called political generals, individuals with significant political connections, such as Northern Democrats or affiliations with immigrant communities, but who often lacked military training or experience. While these appointments were politically strategic, many of them didn't lead to favorable military outcomes. As the war prolonged, both governments had to implement conscription to replenish the rapidly depleting ranks due to battle casualties. Over the course of 3 years, from 1862 to 1865, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia successfully defended against invasions and attacks by the Union Army of the Potomac, which was led by a series of ineffective generals until Ulysses S. Grant assumed command in 1864 as the general-in-chief of all Union armies. Following intense battles at locations like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, Grant eventually cornered Lee at Appomattox in April 1865. Simultaneously, Union forces in the theater of war, encompassing slave states west of the Appalachian mountain chain, secured numerous victories against Confederate armies led by ill-fated or unlucky generals. In 1864 to 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman led his army deep into the heartland of the Confederacy in Georgia and South Carolina, disrupting their economic infrastructure. Additionally, General George Thomas essentially dismantled the Confederacy's Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Nashville. By spring 1865, the main Confederate armies surrendered. When Union cavalry captured Confederate President Jefferson Davis as he fled in Georgia on May 10, 1865, resistance crumbled, marking the end of the war. Subsequently, the taxing process of rebuilding a united nation without slavery commenced. The American Civil War is often described as the last traditional war by some and as the first modern war by others. In reality, it marked a transitional phase and had a significant impact on the technological evolution of modern weaponry and tactics. Various innovations emerged during this war. It was the first war where ironclad warships were used, the first to extensively employ the telegraph and railroad systems, and the pioneer in using rifled ordnance, shell guns, and introducing the Gatling gun, a primitive machine gun. Additionally, it was the first war to witness widespread newspaper coverage, allowing servicemen in the field to vote in national elections and capture events through photographs. The Civil War also pioneered systematic medical care for troops, the use of land and water mines, and the deployment of submarines capable of sinking warships. Furthermore, it was the initial war where aerial reconnaissance was widely used, employing balloons for this purpose. What surprised you the most about the American Civil War? Tell us in the comments below, along with your other thoughts. If you like this video, click the thumbs up button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching.